Good afternoon. Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Today, I am delighted to say that we have our very own Dr. Daud Abdullah, the director of the Middle East Monitor, to discuss his new book, Engaging the World, the Making of Hamas's Foreign Policy. The volume is a very thorough and detailed account of the way in which the Palestinian Liberation Movement, Hamas, has navigated the very difficult and the very choppy waters of foreign policy since its inception in 1987. It walks through the major events of the region, from the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, through the Oslo process, and all the way up to its departure from Syria in 2012, after the country descended into a civil war. I think it offers a great insight into the organization's thinking and decision-making. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Daud to the show. Dr. Daud, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nassim, and thank you to Jihan and all those who work with her to produce this event regularly on Middle East Monitor.
Thank you. We will dive into the key moments which you discuss in your book in a bit. But before we do that, I wanted to ask a bit about why you felt the need to write this book. You opened the book with a quote from your Guyanese Roman Catholic nun and historian, Mary Noel Menezes, who taught you during the undergraduate years you mentioned. It's an interesting quote, so I will repeat it. She says, "It doesn't matter how much you write, you never have the final say. Someone else will always come and add their piece." You then proceed to explain, how you realized that you too wanted to have, quote unquote, your say. So tell us why you wanted to have your say and what you wanted to achieve by writing this book.
Well, when I survey the literature on Hamas, and there is quite a lot of material out there at the moment, I found that I came to the conclusion that most of it focused upon its history, its ideology, its militancy, and its activities in the occupied territories. However, I concluded also that there was a noticeable gap in the literature, in the sense that no one has thus far, produced something comprehensive about its international relations, how it evolved, and its attempt to forge a foreign policy that was coherent and effective and beneficial to the national cause. So that was the motivation to add something new to the literature in an area I felt was lacking.
It's great, thank you for that. But as with a lot of books on Palestine, especially one on Hamas, did you approach the book with any sense of apprehension? I mean, I shouldn't have to ask this question because as a writer, academic, as a historian, one should be able to speak and write freely about academic topics in such a manner. But there seems to be a level of resistance with having the Palestinian story being told. You had that with this particular book itself in one of its launch. Facebook, for instance, penalized MEMO staff for posting an ad of the book. So did you approach the book with any apprehension beforehand?
Not at all. I didn't really have any apprehensions about undertaking the project. Given the fact that so much has been written about Hamas, it's not a taboo subject. Academics, in fact, there's another book which came out on Hamas earlier this year, by an academic from the University of London. So there's a lot of material out there, and there was no need to feel constrained or apprehensive about undertaking this challenge, as it were. Um, of course, there will be critics, as in everything else pertaining to the Palestinian issue, and labels would be, and aspersions would be made, but that should not deter one from pursuing what appears to be and what one is convinced of, that need to shed light and to inform the discourse on this subject. There are many misunderstandings about the movement, and so it was an opportunity rather to address some of these misunderstandings head on, and to clarify it in light of my conversations with its leadership, and my meetings over the years with people at that level.
Yeah, let's begin with a question about the idea of foreign policy itself. Many will say foreign policy is the domain of legitimate state actors, while non-state actors, liberation movements like Hamas, they will lobby, campaign. They don't really have a foreign policy as such. Why do you think this distinction is not valid?
I think this distinction is not valid, primarily because it is outmoded. This is a very old sort of concept and approach to foreign policy. After the Second World War, that began to change, that foreign policy is no longer the domain, or preserve of state actors. And the idea that a liberation movement, the size and importance of Hamas should be relegated to the category of lobbyists. I think it's really unfair, and it reflects a level of misunderstanding. We are speaking about a national liberation movement, a movement that seeks to reverse the last stronghold of European settler colonialism in our world. You see, it's over 100 years since this settler colonial project began in Palestine. And we're speaking about one of the main actors that seeks to regain the national rights of the Palestinian people, to dismantle, as it were, this settler colonial project. And as such, it should not be seen as as a lobbyist organization or in its relationships. Now, mind you, it's important to note that states also lobby. They pay governments, particularly or especially those in the Middle East. They pay millions in various European capitals for influence, for various things, you see. But here, when we speak of a national liberation movement, we're not speaking about a single interest. We're speaking about an entire program, a political, economic, social, developmental program for an entire people. And so it cannot be confined, to the realm of lobbying in that sense. Hamas, as I indicated in the book, the policy evolved over a period of time. Over that 30-year period, we saw relationships within the
I think we'll get to that. I think that kind of neatly takes us into the next question about some of the thinking of Hamas. But that was a good background to why thinking of foreign policy in those terms is outmoded, and it is perfectly legitimate to speak of Hamas having a foreign policy in the way you've described. But as I mentioned earlier, the book goes from the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein and the many challenges which Hamas faced at the time, and also during its handling of the Syrian crisis. In those examples you cite, I think a number of examples in the last three or so decades, did you detect a grand foreign policy strategy in terms of Hamas? You know, what were its guiding principles? What were its red lines? What were the issues it was willing to compromise on? So what was grand strategy when it comes to foreign policy in all those key aspects over the last couple of decades, key moments, I mean?
Well, there are certain constants, if you want to describe it as a grand strategy. And these constants, the foremost of which is, you know, the liberation of Palestine. What was mandatory, the British mandate. Hamas does not recognize, you know, the Zionist project and its settler colonial, you know, enterprise in Palestine. It wants to reverse that, to restore the ownership of the land to the Palestinian people. That's its grand design, if you want to put it in that terms. But it's a fluid, you know, sort of existence. You know, the relationship between itself and other movements and institutions and governments, it is fluid, it's dynamic, it is not static. So at one point, it may have relations with a government which is perhaps hostile to its ideological moorings. But because of its interests, because of its aims, then it is necessary, you know, as it sees it, to engage with such governments. And the book highlights several of those. One example, of course, is that of the Syrian government, which has a long history of antipathy towards the Muslim Brotherhood from which Hamas emerged. But there is a meeting of minds and interests, you see, with that regime, and that is up on Palestine. And this is a guiding factor, you see, or element in its approach to international relations. The common ground is the interest of Palestine, the interest of the Palestinian people, their need for freedom and independence, and the restoration of the national rights. Whoever supports these, then Hamas works with them.
Yeah. So in that sense, what you're saying is that the common dictum in foreign policy terms, if I can use that word, you know, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. Does that also apply to Hamas? I mean, does it go through foreign policy, look at the foreign policy landscape, and how does it negotiate its values and its principles when it comes to real life issues, like, for example, in Kuwait? What did Hamas do? What was Hamas's position when it came to Iraqi invasion of Kuwait? How did it negotiate its values with its long-term strategy? What did it do?
Well, the invasion was illegal, you know, in the sense that one country occupied another and expelled its people. As a Palestinian, this is something that is very hard to condone, to support, to endorse. And Palestinians were subjected to ethnic cleansing, you know, and dispossession of their own land. And to support, you see, this against another people is contrary to the basic their existence, as it were, as a people. You cannot support, an injustice against a people which you yourself have been a victim of. So they condemned the invasion from the very beginning, and they sought to engage with regional actors to persuade Saddam Hussein to withdraw his forces from Kuwait. They were part of several delegations, you see, that went to Baghdad and also to Mecca to try to resolve the issue within the Arab house, the Arab family. Hamas had, from the very beginning, recognized that this crisis was going to lead to the destruction. First of all, it would lead to the intervention of foreign forces in the region. But not only this, it would lead to the destruction of a major country, i.e. Iraq. And so they wanted to resolve the matter within, the Arab family. And as a result, they participated in much of the mediation efforts. However, it should be said that on the ground in Palestine, in the occupied territories in particular, there was support for Saddam Hussein. Even among, you see, and the context of this was the Intifada. The Intifada was still, the first Intifada was still ongoing. And Hamas was playing a major role in directing, the Intifada, the process of the Intifada. And some of its own supporters on the ground, you see, supported Iraq's action in Kuwait. But nevertheless, the leadership itself, in its official statements, disassociated itself and condemned categorically, the actions of Saddam Hussein.
Another example which features in your book, where Hamas found itself really between a rock and a hard place, is the conflict in Syria. But before I move on to other questions, I just wanted to focus on the Syrian issue. How did Hamas negotiate that difficult moment? Because Syria, as many people know, offered Hamas sanctuary. Hamas was based there, the political arm. How did it negotiate? Why did it feel the need to leave Syria in the way it did in 2012? It's quite an interesting moment in its history. Talk us through that.
Well, from the very beginning, when the uprisings took place in Egypt and Tunisia, there was a sense among the Syrian establishment, its political leadership, that this would not come to Syria. These uprisings, Syria was, so immune, if we may say, from what was happening outside. However, the leadership of Hamas, which had a very, very close relationship with the Damascus authorities, suggested that, they should pay attention to what is happening in the region and do whatever is necessary to prevent, a similar descent into chaos and lawlessness. Now, when the uprising actually came knocking at the doors of the Syrian regime, they took the decision that it was going to be dealt with through security means and then through military means. Hamas suggested on several occasions, that it should be approached politically. This was a political problem. Have a dialogue with the local leaders, with the influential people on the ground, and try to resolve the matter internally, in the sense that the regime responded to the demands, to the aspirations of the people but that was not entertained by the leadership in Damascus. So after several attempts, the situation, of course, by that time began to deteriorate. And Hamas was given an ultimatum, really, by President Assad. Either you stand with us and support us, or you don't. We don't want you to be in the middle, as it were. You be on our side. Now, the position, as you rightly said, it was a dilemma. They didn't want to support the people against the regime, and they didn't want to support the regime against the people. You see? And one has to bear in mind also that in Syria, there are over 500, there were rather over 500,000 Palestinian refugees in various camps there. So any action on the part of Hamas, you know, to support, let's say, if it decided to support the regime, what would be the consequences for the, you know, the Syrian refugees who were there? In any case, what happens, the refugees themselves, as you know, became the victims of many attacks, and their numbers have been significantly reduced over the years to, let's say, less than 100,000 at the moment. So that was the situation. They took the decision to leave because it was becoming untenable, unsafe, insecure to maintain a presence in Syria when the regime had become openly hostile, you see, to it, and it could not carry out, it could not conduct or lead the affairs of the movement within that climate. The environment was no longer conducive for it to function, you know, in the way that it wanted to function as a, you know, as a resistance and liberation movement, you know, while it was in Damascus during that period of crisis. So it had to move on to another area.
Let's expand the conversation a bit wider to countries like Russia and China and Hamas's relationship with them. But let's combine two. I mean, in 2006, Hamas challenge stood for election. It was a really pivotal moment, and we know what happened. Hamas won the election, but ultimately it led to a breakdown of relationship with the European Union and the US, and in foreign policy terms, some would say it led to a disaster. But it also offered opportunities in the sense that Hamas began engaging with Russia and China, two countries that have not labeled the Palestinian organization terrorist group. So what was Hamas thinking, first of all, in contesting the election, and how has it capitalized? Well, I don't want to say capitalized. How has it developed its relationship since with countries like Russia and China and elsewhere?
Well, one has to sort of go back a few years and to recognize that, you know, after the announcement of the quartet into the formation of the quartet in 2003 and its conditions, you know, for dealing with Hamas, which were, you know, the three very well-known conditions of recognition of Israel, renouncement of armed struggle, and also recognition of the agreement signed with the PLO, by the PLO with Israel. Those conditions were there, and Hamas rejected them. Now, in terms of Russia, Putin himself made a visit to Palestine, the occupied territories, his first and only one up to date in 2005. And he offered to convene a peace conference in Moscow for the parties. Of course, the Americans rejected this, as well as the Israelis. Now, it must be said that Putin, you know, he has his own restive Muslim population in the Caucasus region, and so his intelligence agencies were encouraging him to forge better relationships and to seize every opportunity to improve relations and his influence in the Muslim world. So that would, assuage the discontent at home. So Palestine offered, was a theater which he calculated, given its prominence among Muslims, the issue of Palestine, given its prominence among Muslims, he felt that this would be a very good area to invest in politically if he could, become an equal part. And this was the thinking. I mean, we had the quartet, they are part of the quartet, but they had been overshadowed, for ever since by the Americans. Now, when the elections took place in 2006 and Hamas won, it wasn't Hamas who made the overture for, the opening up of relationship. It was Putin himself who offered. He said, I want to meet them because they are the elected, legitimately elected representative of the people. And he invited them to Moscow. And that was the beginning of, that relationship that has continued since then, regular exchange of visits both ways. It does not mean that, Russia is, a model of support for the Palestinian people, but nevertheless, Hamas has benefited from that relationship over the years. One good example was in 2018 when the Americans tried to get this resolution in the General Assembly condemning Hamas. Both China and Russia did not vote. They voted against it. So, a movement, the size of Hamas, with its influence and stature and importance, it needs international support, relationships that would allow it to function and to be recognized legitimately as a legitimate body, representing the Palestinian people. This is the position of Russia, and that has been the position of Moscow, of the Chinese also, that once they were elected, there was a decision was taken that they should be dealt with. And mind you, even in Europe, there were, non-EU states which adopted a similar position. And,
that's right. That's the question I wanted to,
and prime ministers.
Sorry, Dr. D, that's kind of where I wanted to go to now. I mean, following on from what you mentioned about the 2018 UN General Assembly resolution, which rejected US efforts to condemn Hamas. So there's been opposition and backlash against the blacklisting of Hamas, even within EU. We know from our own example, Jack Straw, who was the former Foreign Secretary of the UK, he came to a MEMO conference in 2017. He spoke at a conference and he hinted that, he was probably sacked because of his efforts to remove Hamas, start dialogue with Hamas and engage with Hamas. Blair also quartet representative in 2017. He said, boycotting Hamas was really counterproductive. So is this part of Hamas, a success story of Hamas? We know Hamas is trying to lobby and campaign within the EU to remove itself from the blacklist. How successful has this campaign been, and has it been counterproductive really for the Europeans to keep Hamas on its blacklist?
Well, it has been, I'm not sure if we can describe it as being counterproductive, but it has been futile in the sense that you cannot make peace with, your friends. You have to deal with your enemies. So despite the differences of opinion and approaches and views about Hamas, at the end of the day, it is a major political actor on the ground, particularly in Gaza. You know, after 2007, it was in control of the territory, you know, and it had to provide for 2 million people. Will you starve them in Gaza because, you know, they voted for Hamas? No, actually, the European Union adopted this position. You see, they adopted the position that we would give all the aid, or we would channel most of the aid to the West Bank, and we would let the people in Gaza see that, you know, what the benefits they could accrue if they decided to rebel or to subvert Hamas's authority in Gaza. Now, it was a very short-sighted, you know, sort of approach. It's 16 years on, nothing has changed. People are under siege, but they did not rise up, you know, in the way that Israel and its allies in the West hoped, you know, that it would happen. But there's an element of hypocrisy, you see, in this approach, and that came out in the disclosures and statements by several officials. You know, because on the one hand, you had, let's say, the British government, which negotiated with Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, and they came to the Good Friday Agreement, you know, and despite the controversy of IRA arms and its, you know, its commitment to its arms struggle against the British, you know, and the desire to have a united Ireland, and nevertheless, you know, the Brits under Blair and Jack Straw negotiated that. So former officials like Chris Patton, for example, he said, how could you, on the one hand, you know, engage with Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, and at the same time say you don't want to speak to Hamas in Palestine? It doesn't match. But when we look across the board, I mean, we had the UN peace envoy in Palestine at the time, Alvaro de Soto himself, you know, pointing this out, that it was a huge mistake on the part of the West, you know, to try to undermine and to reverse the results of the 2006 elections. Nevertheless, there were certain people within the State Department, in particular in Washington, who decided that, you know, because of its ideology and its militancy and its ultimate objective of liberating Palestine, that they didn't want to, you know, engage with Hamas. And so from the very beginning, people like Condoleezza Rice and Elliot Abrahams took a decision that they wanted to subvert the Hamas government in Gaza. The rest is the outcome, as we know, was a bloody confrontation in which Fatah was defeated in Gaza, and Hamas gained control of the territory.
That's a quite detailed account in your book, how you speak about the quite a vicious campaign led by the US to basically lead a coup in Palestine. We are coming to the end of our time, and I wanted to ask a question about the future, really. Where should Hamas look for allies? Many would argue, analysts would argue, that, you know, we are moving from a unipolar US-dominated world to a multipolar world, you know, with China, Russia becoming more and more assertive. How should Hamas navigate this shift, global shift? Should it look for allies, building allies in Latin America, continue with its efforts with China and Russia, instead of constantly focusing on the Europeans and the Americans and what they think? Because the world is shifting geopolitically. Where do you think Hamas should be focusing its attention?
Well, yeah, we see, you know, when the movement started, a lot of its relations were confined to its immediate Arab, you know, environments. and it forged relationship with the neighboring governments and so on, and then the wider Muslim world, and then the international community. That's how the policy, evolved over the years. But to me, there's something which needs to be revisited in the thinking of the Hamas's leadership. It's sort of emphasis that what it calls is Arab strategic depth, the strategic depth of its Arab neighbors. Today, all of these countries have turned their backs on the Palestinian people. They've signed treaties with the Israelis. They've even supported the settlers. They buy goods from. So it would be foolhardy to continue to labor this point about the strategic depth of the Arab states. Governments in particular with the people is something different. So given the the unwillingness of these Arab countries to support the Palestinian people, Hamas would have to look beyond that geographic space, you see, and it has successfully done so to a degree. In the case of South Africa, it has good relations with the ANC. It has done so in Malaysia in another instance. So I think that should be the thrust. In Latin America, the largest diaspora, Palestinian diaspora outside of the Middle East is in Latin America, and they have great resources, economically, they're well positioned politically, they're well entrenched in these societies. They have been there for close to 100 years, in many instances. So it needs to forge relationships with the broader Latin American societies through, this fertile, latent, ground of Palestinian presence, in that region. I think that should be the way forward. One is not advocating to the neglect, of relationships and the importance of relationships with, Arab states. That is important. I mean, in some cases, it's indispensable, like, relationship with Egypt, countries that they share a border with. It cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, say, well, we don't want to have anything to do with the Egyptian government. But it's a question of emphasis and having an approach that is dynamic, that it looks beyond the region in terms of, in order to achieve its aims and to protect its interests. I think that should be the way forward. And there will be, you see, we've seen during the last decade, the onslaughts on Gaza, the amount of outpouring of support, from, let's say, Latin America. It has to capitalize on this. You see, it has to capitalize on global public opinion as manifested in the boycott and divestment and sanctions campaign. That is the way forward. Through public opinion as well as through official, governmental agencies. It has to work on all fronts.
Thank you, Dr. D. We have come to the end of our time, and on that ambitious and optimistic note, we will have to end our conversation. I really encourage our listeners to buy the book. It sheds really good light on a really neglected issue, on the decision-making process of a very important movement within the Palestinian, self-determination or Palestinian cause. So I want to thank our guest, Dr. Daud Abdullah, for giving his time, and also thank our viewers for joining us, and hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye.